How you doing? Who I am is not important, but what I have to say is important. Now, last week we discussed social health. And at the end of social health, I specifically discussed peer pressure. I mentioned that a large group of people can influence one individual's decision making by forcing or pressuring them into believing that their decision is incorrect or that the decision that they have to make is a necessity. And so I decided to make communication its own exclusive video to discuss various methods of communication for individuals to utilize if they ever find themselves in a situation that may require you to speak up or for you to translate some type of information to somebody else that may not completely understand or perhaps even misunderstand. Now, for starters, I'm going to reiterate something that I said last week as well, in that words and the way that you describe words and the way that you interpret words through language and meaning and hand movements is all a social construct. It is all something that we as people have created in order to be able to indicate to somebody else what we are trying to get you to understand. For example, if I was to use this to point at this painting, it would indicate that I want you to look at the painting and I would want you to describe the painting behind me. And these methods of communication were all formulated when we are younger, and we have to find out ways to communicate what we are feeling, what we are trying to get you to understand or somebody else to understand, because we can't exactly make words into do yet until we understand what the words mean. And words in general are simply just sound that are emulated from our mouths that we create into a language via giving meaning and definition behind the things that we say and the sounds that we make. Now, it is important to note that delivery of how we say things or how we do things is a big thing that you need to watch out for, because misinterpretation and misunderstandings can happen a lot easier than you may think it happens. For example, the tone of your voice can change the entire interpretation of another individual based on how you sound and how you describe the words that you say. For example, if I was to say, "I'm sorry," in a very sincere voice, but if I was to say, "I'm sorry," in a very sarcastic tone of voice, people would interpret that to be fake, would interpret that to be not genuine, because the tone of voice describes something as if you were trying to be snarky about it. And this is something that is very relevant when discussing with other people, because people can misinterpret and misunderstand things all the time, which is why it is important for you as an individual to be aware of how you say things and how you deliver messages, as well as how other people deliver messages, because for all you know, someone trying to deliver a message to you may not be in the way that they think is harmful to you and are simply just trying to have fun, or maybe the opposite, and they may seem like they're trying to have fun but it's trying to be harmful to you. Which is why it is an important lesson when it comes through communication is to listen, is to interpret, is to let the individual attempt their way at communication before you intervene with your own form of communication, because intervening in conversation or in illustration may interrupt the true form of communication that the individual is trying to deliver, and it may make things even more confusing, because now you have to backtrack and figure out what they were trying to say before you intervened. This is something that is actually very crucial and important to parenting specifically, because parenting requires you to understand how your child is trying to communicate things, like if it's hungry, if it has to use the bathroom, if it's not feeling all right, and they have to essentially use hand movements or try to figure out ways, because babies don't know how to communicate yet. And so you as a parent would have to pay attention and view the baby and try to see what it's trying to communicate. In the same vein, as adults and as people in general, we also have to do the same thing, because without truly understanding in full what somebody is trying to say, you might misinterpret that, and you might even misquote them, or you might spread misinformation yourself because you didn't get the full context of a story. Now, it is also important to note, however, that regardless of how you communicate to others, there will never be a full 100% understanding of everything that is going through your mind, because we as people cannot read your mind in its entirety. Your mind is always going, it's always thinking of thoughts, it's always coming up with ideas and concepts. And so that should be very important to note, that when you communicate, it is not going to be an 100% guarantee that what exactly you are communicating is going to be completely in full to another person, which means you might have to find alternative ways that that person specifically may understand to showcase to them so that they can understand a lot more clearly and a lot better. So why exactly is it so difficult for people to be able to communicate? And why may it be very difficult for people to completely understand? Well, when it comes to communication, the reliance is on the communicator. If the communicator is capable of informing the best way that they can. This may include having to find ways to speak clearly, or also having to find ways to describe and demonstrate the things that they are thinking about before truly taking action. That's why the saying usually goes, think before you act, is because when you think, you can be able to act upon it a lot better than if you were to not think and then just go. But a big struggle that the communicator might feel towards the person listening is that regardless of how they display that information or tell that information, there's never going to be a true understanding. And it is this kind of feeling within the communicator that may make things even worse in terms of communicating, and they may hold back something that is very important to communicate, which may cause a big rift in regards to whatever is trying to be told. These feelings of incapability of communicating may conjure up from the person they are trying to communicate to and how they believe that person may interpret something, or the circumstance in which they are trying to communicate about, or the circumstance that they are in currently in regards to what they need to communicate. Then of course you also have the benefactor of the listener and how they are listening and how they are interpreting things themselves, or if they are truly listening at all. For one to be able to deliver information and a message the best way that they can without feeling this way and without feeling like no matter what they do is never going to get through, is to be able to feel comfortable, is to be able to feel like that someone will listen and someone amongst the herd will be able to understand the best way, and then will be able to communicate that back to other people in the best way. Now, for one to feel comfortable in delivering important information, it requires a lot out of both the communicator and the listener to create and craft that comfortable space to be able to get that information across. Sometimes authentically it can happen and nothing can be forced about it. In fact, forcing the situation, forcing a scenario, forcing the communicator to communicate or the listener to listen may not be a smart idea, may not be a wise move, because the individual in question may feel like that they have to participate when they maybe don't want to or don't feel like it themselves. It truly needs to be as authentic as possible for it to work. The circumstance, the people involved, because sometimes it's not as easy as just saying it out loud or just saying it to some random person, saying it to maybe a therapist. Sometimes there's more that needs to be required, or maybe there's less that needs to be required. It all depends on the individual and how that individual interprets information. And for that to be understood and how to be able to understand how a person can communicate to you, you need to analyze the individual in question as well to see if that individual can be able to interpret that information, and two, in the terms of the communicator, if that communicator is capable of communicating the best way for you to be able to listen. But of course, this creates a seemingly cycle paradox where information never gets truly understood, because in order to understand communication, the communicator has to deliver information the best way, but for them to deliver information the best way, they need to feel comfortable with the individual that they are communicating to. And then for the listener to feel comfortable in listening in, they also need to not have a forced scenario. They also have to feel comfortable themselves to listen to you as the communicator and not feel like they are being pressured into listening. So what's the true solution? The true solution to it is authenticity. And for it to be authentic, you just have to take the risk. And when it comes to risk taking, there is no guarantees. And for you to truly be able to understand that there is no guarantees is the key, But how can you understand something that needs to be communicated to you in a way for you to understand that there is no guarantees in understanding in the forms of communication? Well, there really is none. That's kind of where the loop of people fall into, and that's kind of where the struggle of being able to communicate truly is. At a certain point in time, you have to make the judgment call to be able to communicate or listen, depending on the individual. And that requires you as an individual as well to take a risk and see if it's worth the while, because some people may utilize those risks against you and that vulnerability of communication against you as well. But other times, sometimes misinterpretations and misunderstandings can cause for a fallout in the worst ways. Perhaps in regards to certain words that are being utilized and how they are being said. Because in reality, there is no true good or bad words. There is no true curse words. There is no true great words. In reality, it is all on interpretation and what that word can be interpreted as. Some of the banned words and bad words in our English language are only truly bad because of interpretation and how they can be interpreted and how they can be utilized for psychological vulnerability and utilizing that psychology for manipulation. And yet at the same time, sometimes some of those words are not truly as bad as they seem to be, and how they are utilized is all on the manner and the behavior of the individual. Because if an individual was to say it, like I said, in a much more calmer demeanor, then the approach is going to be a lot more sincere. Because if an individual was to do it in a lot more angry demeanor or in a lot more threatening type of demeanor that seems like they are frustrated, that seems like they want to harm, then it's going to be interpreted as harm. This is mainly due to the fact that we instinctively interpret loud sounds or angry demeanors, facial expressions, as threatening, as predators trying to hunt us as prey, or as something that wants to truly harm us physically, albeit there is no 100% guarantee. So what is the true key to communication? It is truly authenticity. This is why it is important for you to be able to try and find the people that are the most helpful for you. And the only way for you to find the people that are most helpful for you is to communicate. It is quite the paradox that makes a lot of people give up trying and give up in general. And whilst there is no easy way for authenticity to happen, at least one person will understand your way of thinking. And that one person, even though they may not be the shoulder for you to cry on always, they may be there just when you need it most, without them even realizing it. Or maybe they do realize it, and maybe they want to do it. It all depends on perspective and authenticity of that perspective and perception of communication. And with that, I think it's a good time to wrap up. Next week, we are going to be going over spiritual health and the belief systems of many people and how they utilize those belief systems for their own life to be able to find much more happiness and joy. So I will see you next week in class, if you do choose to attend, of course.